Hello and welcome to Monkey's Paperpalooza Craft Corner. Today we're going to go into a little tutorial on the introduction of inks. Now this is not a video for you who are experts on inks. This is an introduction for the beginners, just learning about inks and what they do. So here I have a huge amount of inks here, and they are all different types that you can use for stamping, heat embossing, and all kinds of fun techniques. Now, I'm going to go through with you guys what each of these inks can do, as well as tips on care and maintenance of these inks and how to store them, because storage is very important as well as use. Now, but first I'm going to go over my top 3 inks to have in your collection. So starting on number 1 is a dye-based ink. Now, honestly, for beginners, you really only need 3 types of inks, dye being the major type of ink, and you can get these inks in various types of things. So these are part of my top 3. So you see here I got 3 little mini cubes as well as a larger cube of ink. I use all of these. These 3 are the top names, where Studio G is a cheaper brand that you can get made by, I believe it is, let me flip it over, I think it tells me on the back here, Hampton Arts. So by Hampton Arts, and you can get this at Walmart for very inexpensive. It's a good, if you don't have the money to buy any of these name brands or are just starting, it's a good starter ink. But there are tons of dye-based inks out there, not just these types. Now, I mainly use Memento, and the main reason I use Memento is that it's fade resistant. It is also very good for coloring with markers, so if you use Copics or other types of markers and you don't want your ink to kind of rub off or blend or bleed into your color, that is a good one to use. Now, Hero Arts is a dye-based ink also. I do find it uber watery sometimes and a little bit runny, so I find it really works good for ink blending more than it does for stamping, especially if you're stamping sentiments. Distress Inks is basically a technique ink versus a stamping ink. It's good for ink blending and fun watercolor techniques, though you can use the Hero Arts for the same things. The Distress is a little bit more reactive to water, which makes it more fun. And look, I already got ink all over my hands. This is what happens when you play with inks. Now, Studio G, like I said, it is a basic dye-based ink. It is acid-free, of course, and it has a very slick pad, which does make it kind of hard sometimes to stamp for. Let's see if I can get it in the light so you can see how slick it is. It is not a sponge or fibrous pad. It is very slick and plasticky. So that's why, if you are getting serious, I would go into some other inks. Simon Says Stance makes one. Ranger makes full range. Altenew makes a beautiful ink. Stampin' Up, if you love their products, there's a good one there. Lawn Fawn, and also my favorite things, makes a beautiful ink. Hero Hues, which is very similar to these little cubes here. And also Colorbox. So makes some beautiful inks also. So great way to see some of these wonderful inks that are out there. So number 1 on my list, if you're starting your toolbox, get a dye-based ink. It is what you're going to use majority of the time for your card making. Now going into pigments. Now, what is a pigment ink? It is opaque. Memento and dye-based inks are transparent, which I did not say before. Transparent inks will not show on darker colored papers. They are great for lighter color papers that are lighter than the color they are. Thus, they will show on lighter papers, whereas on darker papers, they won't. This is where pigment inks come in. They are super wet, they are opaque, and they do show on darker papers. And here's another one, Hero Arts Unicorn White. I use that one a lot. Studio G, of course, being the lesser of these brands. Brilliance being a nice brand. They make her as Memento. But like I said, the key ingredient about this is it will show on black paper, which this Memento will not. So if you are going to be stamping on dark paper, number 2 on your kit will be a good pigment ink. And there are a lot of different pigment inks out there, not just those 3. Versacolor makes one, Ranger makes one, Avery and Al makes one, Delicata makes a beautiful metallic brands, as well as Lawn Fawn, and Simon Says Stamp makes one also. So definitely something good. Now, number 3, if you were going to choose 3 inks to be in your toolbox, number 3 would be a embossing pad. Now, embossing is a fantastic technique that makes a raised texture. It's good for resists and as well as putting it on top of an ink surface. And you can get full range of colors. And this is one that I'm showing here to show you the raised look on a card with a sentiment. And that's what you get with this. So if you haven't ever heat embossed, it gives a nice clear plasticky feel. Now you can heat emboss with a pigment ink or even a dye-based ink, though they are a little faster drying, so they will be almost instantaneously putting it on as soon as you can. The pigment and the embossing ink are both very slow drying, so that makes it easier to put it on. So once your powder is on, you will heat set this just lightly with a heat gun made for embossing on crafts, and you will be able to have that wonderful either textured or raised surface. Now there are other brands out there, one of the major ones being Versamark, and actually I have been using my Versamark actually in my emboss pad, so I ran out of the Ranger. They're very similar formulations, and also they come in pens too. You can get the Wow pen or even the Versamark pen, and I believe Emboss has made a pen also that you can use as a embossing pen. Next is my thing about specialty inks. Now, there is a lot of specialty inks out in the market right now that are fantastic. Do you have to go buy them right away? No. It's something you work into, one being the distress oxides. These are a dye and pigment ink hybrid, meaning they have qualities of both in them. They give a nice chalky residue, but they are very reactive to water, whereas most pigment inks are not reactive to water. And you can also emboss it with embossing powder if you do, because it does stay wet longer. Very similar to it is the Hero Arts new reactive line, though I find it is a little less pigmenty and more dye-based, though it is just as creamy as the distressed oxides. And it is also very reactive to water and blends nicely. These you can get them in mini or large, except for the distressed oxide. So far, he hasn't come out with a mini in that, though I'm looking forward to hopefully he will sooner or later. Wendy VG's Make Art blendable inks are very similar to the Hero Arts. They are very creamy and blendable, but they have a beautiful texture to them. And I don't know if they're water reactive or not. I haven't ever tested them yet. This one I'm on my wish list. Hero Arts has ombre inks. It has multiple color pads that make a ombre effect. A same effect you can do with your inks, but it makes it a little easier and less worry about contamination of your ink pads. Glue pads. Now, these are a tricky little substance. I would not recommend them for beginners ever. They are very tricky, and often you can ruin your stamps if you don't use them correctly. You can get the same effect actually with embossing pad and a sticky embossing powder, which this glue would work good for glitters and mica powders and pearl powders to make it stick to it. You can also use it for heat embossing also. So I would recommend going the other way versus those. Now the newest thing on the market, I have to say is the most fun, is the new alcohol lift ink. This is reactive to alcohol inks, what we'll go into next. What it does is you can put it on your stamp, you can lift the image off the alcohol Yupo paper that you have your design on and then transfer it to another piece of Yupo paper. And it's kind of interesting and fun. So let's talk about alcohol inks. Alcohol inks are a permanent ink. They are basically an ink color with alcohol in it. So they are very flammable and this is where you can use your alcohol lift. Now, three major brands are Adirondack, Rangers, and Pinata. Though both of the Adirondack and the Ranger are the same, maker by Tim Holtz. This is what you get with it. You get this if you get Upo paper or Upo cardstock, and or even some photo papers. You can get this fun little splotchy effect with these inks, and they're fun. They sink right into the paper, and you can even do it on vellum sometimes too. Like I said, these two are made by the colors are made by Tim Holtz. Pinata has their own line also. That is also very good. Staying on the permanent line, let's talk about archival or permanent inks. Now, if you color a lot and you have a lot of worry about your substance getting wet and it's going to rub off, do it on wood or tile and make stamped images on it to color. You're going to want these inks. They do not move. They are permanent inks. They will not rub off. They are fade resistant. They are wonderful. Now you can get the same effect with markers though with Memento and some of the fade resistant inks, but these are fun too. So we got Color Box and also stays on, as well as Ranger's Archival. Though I am saying that Archival right now has the top amount of colors. So they even have some that go with your distressed inks. Tim Holtz just put out a distressed line with Ranger in the Archival inks, so you have colors that match those, which is kind of fun and interesting. Now, I use the Archival mostly because I really do like their line, but it's just as good as the rest. Now, what you're saying, well, do I need all these inks? No, you do not need all these inks. Depending on what you're doing, the inks are going to be good. Now, you can get them in mini or large. Like this is a mini. Is it worth getting a mini? Yes. You do get more bang for your buck because you can get more little minis, and they're great for small storage spaces because they're very compact and small. And the same thing with the Memento. You can get them in the regular size cube like the Ranger, or you can get them in big. So depending on what you need, you can get the size you need it for. So I love the minis versus the large only because they're easier to store, and sometimes they're easier to stamp the images because you don't have as much residual inking going off your stamp. And sometimes getting in those tiny little corners is great. So do I recommend minis? In a way, yes, because they're great for, like I said, storage and getting into the smaller stamps. And you can get a large range of colors for the same price as getting a big pad. Now, I know Ranger has small ones in the Archival. Distress Oxides and Studio G do not yet. But most of all, I'm going to suggest if you use a lot of one color, buy a reinker. You do not want to throw away your ink pad and go buy another one. That is just too much money to waste. Just buy a reinker and they go a long way. Now, I would say if you use a lot of one color, buy that color. If you don't use another color, do not buy that color. Archival, you can get it, like I said, Studio G. I don't know if they have reinkers. You can get them for your embossing inks, but invest in reinkers instead of buying new ink pads because in the long run, you're going to save so much money. Because imagine how much reinking you can get out of this little bottle on that mini ink pad. Numerous. I mean, I've had some for 2 years and I still haven't gone through half the bottle. So it's definitely worth it. Save yourself some money. Buy reinkers for the ones you use a lot and keep them in your stash. And that way, when you need to reink them, because they're looking faded, do them. Now, like I said, those are a great way to save money there. But now we also got to consider, is it worth reinking all of these? No. Reink the ones you use. As important as reinking is, you need to also think about storage. Now, storage is just as important as keeping your ink in supply. You got to store your ink pads correctly. And yes, there is a correct way to store ink pads and an incorrect way. Now, dye-based inks and pigment inks are two different types of inks. Dye inks are water-based, so your ink is going to sink from the top down to the bottom, and they're going to settle on the bottom of your pad. Now, this is what I'm going to say to you. You don't want the ink to be on the bottom of your pad. So the way to keep it to the top is to store it upside down. And you're like, but how will I know what color ink it is? Well, a lot of these brands have actually started putting labels on the side, like Memento does, a lot of the brands, because we are starting to store our inks in boxes and in walls and in things. We're not storing them in drawers anymore. So do it. And you see, this is what I did. You can label them on the side too, so you can see your color. You can even flip them upside down if you wanted. But for your dye-based inks, I would recommend storing them upside down because that keeps your ink on the top versus on the bottom. Some of the rag ones don't need it as much, but some of your cheaper ones. Same thing with your archival. Store it upside down. Now, Pigment is a different entity. Now, Pigment is it's not watery. It kind of sits on the top of things. It dries slowly. It does not need the special storage for it. It can be stored with it being top up because your ink is going to stay right on the top. It's not going to sink in like the dye inks. It's going to stay on the top. So dye inks down, pigments up. And if you store them that way, you'll get more use and more longer term ink usage. Distress oxide is the same thing with the pigments. Since it's got that pigment mixture, it does not need to be stored upside down. As you see, like I said, the rag coated ones, sometimes you can get away with storing them right side up versus upside down because it's kind of thicker. Same thing with the Memento, that's kind of a rag inside, but for safety, just store them upside down. It really does save you, keep your ink on top and your more inkier surface where you want it versus where you don't want it. Now, same thing with embossing pads. Embossing pads, it is, and yes, mine is gross. You can clean these. Just take a damp cloth, clean it up, and then you just clean it, and you re-ink it with a re-inker. You can buy a new one, it's just more costly, and it gets you pretty much down to new again. And being that these are spongy and the substance is stickier, it does not need to be stored upside down. You can store it just like you do your pigment inks, right side up, but also always buy yourself a re-inker for that also. What do I say you should buy if you're starting out? That is tricky because if you aren't doing certain things, you may not need certain inks. So basically, what should you get? Well, okay, so you're not embossing. Don't buy that. So you're not doing permanent things or don't want it to wipe off, be permanent forever. Get rid of that. If you're not doing any ink blending, you don't need those. So for beginnings, I would say your top inks are going to be your pigment and your dye. Now, everybody should start with one of those because if you have dark surfaces, you're going to need that pigment, and dye just does everything. So if you want to just start with 2 inks and work your way to the rest of the inks, buy yourself a good dye-based ink and buy yourself a good pigment, and then buy your re-inkers for those because you can work your way into the distress line, into the embossing, into the archival, more permanent inks. You can work your way into those. If you need to start with 2, start with those 2. Then, if you really want to know the top 3 I recommend, I would say an embossing pad and these dye-based and pigment ink. Because those are going to be your major ones you're going to need right away. Like I said, the rest, work on as you get through it, learn techniques with them, and then work your way into them. So for starting stampers, those 3 are my 3. The others are just added ones you can add. And I hope this helped you. If you enjoyed this video, please watch the last uploaded video as well as one specially curated just for you. And like always, we welcome you to like, ring for notifications, as well as subscribe. And make sure to check out our website as well as our Facebook and Instagram pages.